For 6 aching years, the little girl kept reaching for her right ear. It was an unconscious habit, a silent plea that the whole world ignored. Every doctor, from the famed Mayo Clinic to the top neurological experts at Johns Hopkins, from Switzerland to Japan, said the very same thing. "We're powerless, sir. Nerve damage. Permanent." Her father, Alexander Blackwood, spent millions of dollars, flew across the world, demanded the specialists examine her again and again. Every one of them shook their head, offered condolences, and then handed over the bill. But then an ordinary housemaid noticed what no one else had seen, and what she found inside that child's ear would leave you unable to speak. Alexander Blackwood wasn't just wealthy. He was a force. The boss who controlled half of Chicago's underworld. The man whose name made an entire city go cold with fear. He had a fortress of a mansion in the suburbs, an armed security detail, and a kind of power most people in Chicago couldn't imagine in 20 lifetimes. But his daughter, Mia, had been deaf since she was 2. Now 8 years old, she had never once heard the Chicago wind sweeping across Lake Michigan, never heard her own name. His wife, Catherine, had been killed in an assassination by a rival gang when Mia was only 2. The shock was too great. The doctor said it was the reason the little girl lost her hearing. Catherine never got to hear her daughter say Mom, and Alexander lived with guilt every day, because if he weren't who he was, his wife wouldn't have died, and his daughter wouldn't be trapped in silence. So he kept searching, kept paying, kept forcing doctors all over the world to find him an answer. What he didn't know was that the answer wouldn't come from any glamorous European hospital. It wouldn't come from any famous specialist. It would come from the young woman he had just hired to scrub his floors. Hazel Morgan, 27 years old, had once been an outstanding nursing student, until she was forced to drop out in her 3rd year. In America's harsh economy, a dream doesn't guarantee a meal. She had no connections, no one to lift her up. Just a woman trying to earn enough money to get a kidney transplant for her younger brother. But Hazel noticed something about Mia that every expert with a doctorate had missed. Something deep in the girl's ear. Something dark. And on a night of driving snow, when Alexander was trapped downtown, she made a decision. A decision that would save the child's life, or get her killed by the most ruthless mafia boss in Chicago. If this story touched your heart, please hit like to help spread its meaningful message. Share the video with anyone who needs a reminder that miracles sometimes come from the most unexpected place. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss the next deeply moving story. 6 years ago, on a December night so cold it seemed to cut straight through flesh, Alexander Blackwood was sitting in a sealed meeting room on the top floor of a 5-star hotel in downtown Chicago. Partners from the East Coast were laying out a deal worth tens of millions of dollars, but Alexander wasn't truly listening. His mind was back home with Catherine and Mia, thinking about how clearly his little girl had babbled Daddy that morning. His phone vibrated. He meant to ignore it, but it was the number for his home security detail. They never called unless something was wrong. Alexander picked up. Jonah's voice, the head of security, trembled and warped, as if he was trying to speak and couldn't. "Boss, ma'am, Catherine." That was all it took for Alexander's world to collapse. He burst out of the meeting room without a word to anyone, threw himself into a car, and tore toward home at 100 miles an hour. Red lights, signs, traffic laws. None of it meant anything anymore. There was only one thought. Catherine. Mia. God, please, don't. When Alexander shoved the door open and stepped into the living room, he saw hell. Catherine was lying there, on white marble that had been stained red, 3 bullet wounds in her chest, her eyes wide open, fixed on the ceiling, all life gone. And right beside her, little 2-year-old Mia sat in her mother's blood, tiny hands smeared with dark red, her mouth screaming without stopping. The child's screams tore through the night, tore through Alexander's soul. He lunged forward, yanked Mia away from Catherine's body, and crushed his daughter to his chest. Mia kept screaming. Screaming until her voice went raw. Screaming until there was no sound left. Alexander bellowed for an ambulance. For Jonah. For anyone who could hear him. But he already knew it was too late. Catherine was gone. And the Moretti gang, the rivals he'd been fighting over territory, had delivered a message in blood. That night, after the police left, after Catherine's body was taken to the morgue, Alexander sat by Mia's bed until morning. The little girl had stopped screaming, but she'd stopped talking too, stopped responding, stopped turning her head at any noise, as if a 2-year-old had shut the door of her soul, severing every connection to the outside world. The doctors came, examined her, and shook their heads. The trauma was too great, they said, and it had caused permanent damage to the auditory nerve. Mia would never hear again. Alexander took revenge. Within 3 months, the Moretti crew was wiped from Chicago completely. One by one, from the boss to the foot soldiers, no one survived. But when the last enemy finally fell, Alexander faced a brutal truth. Blood couldn't buy back sound. His daughter was still drowning in silence. And Catherine still couldn't come back to life. Across half the city, in a damp rented room on the south side, Hazel Morgan was living with her own ghosts. 8 years earlier, when she was 19, and in her second year of nursing school, her mother had been diagnosed with late-stage cancer. Her father had walked out when Hazel was little and never looked back once. Hazel cared for her mother alone through the brutal nights of chemotherapy, the days of vomiting and exhaustion, the final months when her mother was nothing but skin and bone and despairing eyes. Her mother died on an autumn morning. Hazel missed her final exams. She dropped out, sold everything in the house to pay off the hospital debt. Then Tommy got sick. Her younger brother, her only brother, the boy she'd promised her mother she would protect at any cost, went into kidney failure. The cost of dialysis every week swallowed nearly everything Hazel earned from 3 jobs at once. She waited tables during the day, cleaned offices at night, and babysat on the weekends. Still not enough. Last night, Tommy had been hit by a wave of unbearable pain. His body convulsed on the old bed, lips gone pale, sweat soaking through him. Hazel held him, crying without a sound, whispering promises into his ear that she didn't know if she could keep. "I'll save you. I swear. I'll find the money. You'll get a new kidney. You'll live, Tommy. You have to live." This morning, when Tommy had finally fallen asleep from sheer exhaustion, Hazel scrolled through her phone looking for work. And she saw it. A job posting for a housemaid at the Blackwood estate. A salary 5 times higher than normal. Blackwood. In Chicago, everyone knew that name. The mafia boss, the man who killed without flinching, a devil wearing human skin. But Hazel didn't have any other choice. She looked at Tommy sleeping, at the sickly pallor of his skin, at the bruises left by needles. Then she pressed apply. Even if she had to step into the devil's den, she would do it. For Tommy, she was willing to trade away everything. The next morning, Hazel stood before the iron gate of the Blackwood estate, both hands clenched around the strap of an old, battered handbag that held a few changes of clothes and her personal things. The November wind cut like a knife against her skin, but she knew she was trembling for more than the cold. In front of her was a fortress, in the most literal sense. A gray stone wall more than 4 meters high wrapped around the entire property, topped with a line of razor-sharp iron spikes like spears pointed at the sky. Security cameras were mounted everywhere, one every few meters, panning slowly to watch every angle. Bodyguards in black suits patrolled with the steady rhythm of soldiers in a military camp, each man carrying a suspicious bulge beneath his arm where a gun was hidden. Hazel drew a deep breath, stepped up to the guard booth, and presented her documents. The guard looked her up and down with an icy stare, checked the list, then nodded her through. The massive iron gate began to open, slow and heavy, and Hazel walked into a world that didn't feel real. A stone-paved driveway ran straight toward the mansion, stretching before her like a dream so lavish it bordered on the unreal. The grounds covered 15,000 square feet, with lawns trimmed to perfection even in the heart of winter, flower beds asleep for the season yet tended with meticulous care, and a marble fountain shut down in the freezing weather. The mansion itself was a Gothic revival castle, with sharp spires reaching upward, stained glass windows, and a gray granite facade that felt both magnificent and threatening. This wasn't a home. This was a king's territory, and everything inside it screamed power. Hazel climbed the stone steps. The enormous oak doors opened, and she stepped into the interior. Warm air from central heating rushed over her, yet it couldn't drive out the chill spreading through her chest. The main hall was vast, its floor laid with spotless white Italian marble veined with gray like blood vessels. The ceiling rose 6 meters high, where a gigantic crystal chandelier hung suspended, thousands of glass pieces glittering like frozen tears. A grand double staircase curved up to the next floor, its railing carved with exquisite detail, a red carpet running through the space like a river of blood. But what made Hazel shiver wasn't the luxury, it was the silence. No music, no conversation, no laughter. Only the sound of her own footsteps echoing across stone, and a stillness as heavy as lead pressing down on everything. This house was rich enough to steal your breath, and yet, It was dead. Dead from the inside. A man appeared from the left corridor, moving without a sound, as if he'd spent his whole life practicing how to become invisible. He was about 55. Salt and pepper hair slicked neatly back, dressed in a black suit without a single wrinkle. His face was cold as ice, empty of expression, and his gray eyes, sharp as a razor, swept over Hazel from head to toe. Hazel Morgan. His voice wasn't a question, it was a statement. I'm Crawford, the estate's butler. Follow me. There was no greeting, no polite smile, no warmth of any kind. Hazel followed him in silence through long, hollow corridors, past large oil paintings, expensive vases, and closed doors. Crawford led her to a small room in the servants' quarters, where she would live from now on. Then he turned back, folded his arms across his chest, and began reciting the rules in a voice as cold as a death sentence. Rule number 1. You don't speak to Mr. Blackwood unless he speaks to you first. Rule number 2. You don't look him in the eye under any circumstances. Rule number 3. You don't set foot on the 3rd floor. That's Miss Mia's private area. And the most important rule. Listen carefully. Crawford stepped closer, his voice dropping into a terrifying whisper. You do not interact with the child in any way. No talking, no smiling, no looking, no coming near her. The child doesn't exist to you. Do you understand? Hazel nodded, her throat gone dry. Crawford didn't stop. The maid before you, a young girl fresh out of school, smiled at Miss Mia when she happened to meet her in the garden. Just a smile. She was fired before the sun set that day. He tilted his head, his gaze drilling into Hazel as if it could pierce skin. And the one before that was even more curious. She tried to find out about the child. Asked other staff questions. She doesn't work in Chicago anymore. In fact, no one knows where she is. A heavy silence settled. Hazel understood the real meaning behind those words. She swallowed, her voice rough and dry. I understand clearly, Mr. Crawford. I'm only here to work. Crawford watched her for a few seconds more, as if judging whether she could be trusted, then gave a curt nod. Good. You start work tomorrow morning. Don't make me repeat anything. He turned and walked away, leaving Hazel alone in the small chilly room. She sat down on the narrow single bed, looked around at the bare white walls, and thought of Tommy lying in that damp rented room, waiting for his sister to save his life. Tommy, she whispered into the empty air. I'll save you. Even if I have to walk into hell. I'll do it. I promise. The first week passed like a nightmare stretched out in silence. Hazel woke at 5 o'clock in the morning, worked until 10 o'clock at night, and in all that time she learned one thing. The Blackwood estate wasn't a home. It was a massive tomb for the living. The servants moved like ghosts. They walked without a sound, as if their feet didn't want to touch the ground. They didn't speak to one another except in curt work exchanges. They didn't laugh, didn't whistle, didn't hum a single tune. Their eyes stayed lowered, their shoulders stayed hunched, and their whole bodies carried the fear of creatures who had learned to survive by becoming invisible. Hazel tried to start conversations with a few of them in the early days, but they only stared at her in panic and slipped away as if she'd invited them to jump off a cliff. Little by little, she learned silence too. Learned to move lightly. Learned how not to exist. But her ears still heard. One afternoon, as Hazel was cleaning near the kitchen area, she caught the cooks and helpers whispering. They spoke low enough to think no one could hear, but loud enough for the words to slide into Hazel's ear like poison. Do you know what the boss did to that traitor last year? One of them asked, voice shaking. Strangled him, bare hands, right in the study. The body was carried out at midnight. What about the little girl? Another cut in. They say she's cursed. The price for her father's sins. So many people died under Mr. Blackwood's hand, and when their resentment couldn't strike anyone else, it poured into his daughter. Don't look him in the eye. A third voice warned. Never. They say the last person who did got fired on the spot. Or worse. Hazel walked away quietly, her heart beating faster than it should. She told herself she only had to work, earn money, save Tommy. Everything else had nothing to do with her. But then she saw Mia. It was late afternoon on the 5th day, when Hazel was assigned to clean the back veranda overlooking the garden. She was wiping the glass doors when her eyes drifted outside by accident, and her heart felt like someone had closed a fist around it. In the bare winter garden, on a cold stone bench, a little girl sat completely alone. 8 years old, a white dress, long black hair falling over her shoulders. Her head was bent down as small fingers picked up pebbles one by one and lined them into a perfectly straight row on the bench. 1 stone, 2 stones, 3 stones, slowly, carefully, alone, no nanny beside her. No friends, no doll, no toy of any kind, just an 8-year-old child, and lifeless stones in a cold that cut into skin. Hazel stood there, forgetting to wipe the glass, and watched. She could see loneliness in every line of the child's face. A loneliness so deep it was almost visible, wrapping around Mia like a dark, misty fog. And then Hazel saw it. Mia paused, lifted her right hand, and touched her right ear. The motion was quick, unconscious, like a habit carved into bone. Then she went back to arranging stones. A few minutes later, she touched her ear again, then again, and every time she did, the child's face tightened, only slightly, but clearly in pain. Hazel's chest drew tight, the instinct of a third-year nursing student, buried under years of hard survival, suddenly woke up. She knew that sign. She had seen it somewhere before. But before she could think further, the sound of an engine rose from the front of the estate. Hazel snapped back to her work, but from the corner of her eye she saw him. Alexander Blackwood entered the mansion with a formidable security detail. He was taller than she'd imagined, at least 6 feet 1, with broad shoulders and the stride of a man used to ordering life and death, black hair with a few strands of silver at his temples, a sharply angled face that looked carved from stone, and gray eyes as cold as a snowstorm sweeping across everything in dew. His gaze passed over Hazel, just 1 second. 1 brief second, but in that second, she felt stripped to the bone. As if he could read every secret she was hiding, every fear she was holding down. Then he walked past, without a word, without a gesture that acknowledged she existed. Hazel lowered her head, her heart skittering, and watched him from the corner of her vision. Alexander went straight up to the 3rd floor. 10 minutes later, she saw him through Mia's window, sitting beside his daughter in an armchair near the glass. He didn't speak, because Mia couldn't hear. He just sat there, looked at his child, 10 minutes in absolute silence. Then he stood and walked out. As Alexander crossed the 3rd floor hallway, Hazel noticed something no one else seemed to. The shoulders of the Chicago Mafia boss, the shoulders that carried the weight of an entire underworld empire, sagged heavily. His steps slowed, weary, as if every stride was a fight against himself. And for a flicker of time, that cold, ruthless face cracked, revealing something Hazel never expected to see. Pain. The pain of a father watching his daughter sink into darkness and being unable to do anything. Hazel turned back to the glass and kept wiping, but only one thought filled her mind. Behind the infamous cruelty of Chicago's mafia boss was a man breaking a little more each day from helplessness. And his little girl, that lonely child out in the winter garden, kept touching her ear with a look of pain that no one seemed to notice. In the 2nd week, Hazel was assigned to garden work. It meant being outside in Chicago's cold that cut into skin and bone. But she didn't complain, because the back garden was where Mia usually sat each afternoon. Hazel raked dry leaves, trimmed branches, cleared the beds that had gone dormant for winter, and stole glances at the child from a distance. Mia still sat on the same stone bench, still lined up pebbles in neat rows, still lonely in a way that made her chest ache, and she still touched her right ear with a look of pain that no one noticed except Hazel. That afternoon, as Hazel was pulling weeds near a flower bed about 10 steps from Mia, she saw something that tightened her heart. Mia was holding a small box against her chest, an old wooden music box painted white, with yellow rose designs faded by time. The girl was trying to lift the lid, her tiny fingers clinging to the edge of the wood, tugging, jerking, twisting, but the lid wouldn't move. The spring inside had jammed. Hazel knew exactly what it was. It was Catherine's keepsake, the music box that, according to whispers among the staff, the late mistress used to open every night to lull her child to sleep. Mia couldn't hear the melody, but she kept it like treasure. Maybe because it was the only thing left of her mother that she was allowed to touch. And now it wouldn't open. Mia's fingers trembled, her nails scraping at the wood in desperation. Then she stopped, stared down at the silent box, and her small face crumpled. Tears gathered, ready to spill, her lips pressed tight as she tried to hold them back. But Hazel could see her shoulders shaking. An 8-year-old child, on the verge of crying because she couldn't open the last keepsake of her mother. Hazel stood there with the gardening trowel still in her hand, and a battle erupted inside her head. The rules. Crawford. You must not interact with the child. The maid before her had been fired for a single smile. The one before that had vanished from Chicago. Alexander Blackwood could kill her, and no one would dare ask a question. But Mia was about to cry. She was sitting there alone in a freezing winter garden, about to break because she couldn't reach the last memory of her mother. And Hazel couldn't turn away. She couldn't. Before she could think any further, Hazel set the trowel down and walked closer. She sat on the ground a few feet from Mia, close enough for the girl to notice she was there, but far enough not to invade her space. Then Hazel tapped her fingers lightly against the earth, creating small vibrations. Mia lifted her head, eyes red, and when she saw Hazel, she startled and scooted back. Her gaze was frightened, guarded, like a small animal cornered. She was used to adults either ignoring her or looking at her with pity, and both made her want to fold into herself. But Hazel did neither. She only smiled. A gentle, warm smile, with no pity in it, no fear. Then she pointed at the music box in Mia's hands, pointed at her own hands, and mimed opening a lid. The meaning was clear. "May I help you?" Mia stared at her, suspicious, unsure. 10 seconds passed in silence. Then 20. Hazel didn't rush. She just sat there, smiling, waiting. Finally, slowly, Mia extended the box toward Hazel. Hazel accepted it carefully, and examined the mechanism. The hinge had rusted with time, and the spring inside was stuck from lack of oil. With her fingernail she scraped away a little built-up grime along the edge, then pressed at exactly the right spot. 30 seconds later, the lid popped open. Inside, a tiny porcelain ballerina began to spin on a mirrored base. The melody didn't play because the music spring still needed repair, but the dancer still turned, slow and graceful, as if performing in a world without sound. Mia watched the ballerina spin. Her eyes widened, lighting up as though 1,000 stars had been struck inside them. And then she smiled. It was a small, hesitant smile, as if her face had forgotten how to do it after so many years, but it was there, the first smile in a very long time. Hazel felt her own eyes sting. She nodded to Mia, stood up, and returned to her work as if nothing had happened. But from that moment on, everything changed. The next day, Hazel left a little purple wildflower she'd picked along the road on the stone bench. When she came back in the afternoon, the flower was gone, and in its place was a crude colored pencil drawing, a yellow sun with long rays. Hazel smiled, folded the drawing, and slipped it into her pocket. The day after that, she left a smooth round stone, white as a bird's egg. Mia left a drawing of a star. Then Hazel left a heart-shaped leaf. Mia left a drawing of a woman with red hair and a wide smile. Hazel looked at the drawing, and tears fell. They couldn't talk, Mia couldn't hear, and Hazel didn't dare speak for fear of being discovered. But they had found a language of their own, a language made of small gifts, of innocent drawings, of clumsy gestures, of glances exchanged across a winter garden, of stolen smiles when no one was watching. 2 weeks slipped by in secret, and in those 2 weeks, Hazel watched Mia more closely than ever. The girl touched her right ear more and more. The motion wasn't only habit anymore, it became urgent, desperate, and each time she did it, the pain on Mia's face grew clearer. She was hurting, truly hurting, and no one knew. What couldn't be avoided finally happened one weekend afternoon at the end of the second week. Hazel was standing near the stone bench, pretending to pull weeds while secretly handing Mia a small drawing she'd sketched the night before, a butterfly with wings of many colors. Mia was smiling down at the picture, and Hazel was smiling at the child, when a voice as cold as ice sounded behind her. "Morgan." Hazel shot to her feet, turned around, and her heart dropped into her stomach. Crawford was standing there, less than 3 steps away, gray eyes razor sharp as he looked at her, the way you'd look at an insect you were about to crush. How long had he been there? What had he seen? "I warned you, Morgan." Crawford's voice didn't rise, but every word landed like a hammer. "Do you think the rules in this estate are a joke?" Hazel tried to keep her voice steady, even as her heart pounded out of control. "Mr. Crawford." She came close to me on her own. "I didn't start it." "Shut your mouth." Crawford cut her off, each word like a blade. "I don't want excuses. I want compliance. And you have failed." He turned to Mia, who was curled in on herself on the bench, wide-eyed and terrified as she looked back and forth between the 2 adults. Then Crawford looked at Hazel again, his gaze so cold it turned cruel. "Come with me. Mr. Blackwood wants to see you." Hazel's heart seemed to stop. She followed Crawford into the mansion, her steps heavy as if her shoes were filled with lead. They moved through familiar corridors, up the stairs, past heavy oak doors, until they stopped before a set of double doors at the end of the second-floor hall. Crawford knocked, waited a second, then opened the doors and motioned Hazel inside. Alexander Blackwood's study was darker than any place Hazel had seen in the house. Heavy, dark red velvet curtains were drawn tight, blocking all natural light. Only a desk lamp cast a pale yellow pool over a massive oak desk in the center of the room. The air held the faint scent of whiskey and cigars, mixed with leather from the armchairs and old paper from bookcases that rose to the ceiling. Alexander sat behind the desk, not looking up when she entered. He was reading something, or pretending to read, an expensive fountain pen turning slowly between his fingers. The door closed behind Hazel. She stood there in the dark room, alone with the most infamous mafia boss in Chicago. "You made contact with my daughter." Alexander's voice came out low and cold, with no emotion Hazel could recognize. Hazel swallowed. "Sir, she came close to me. I didn't ask for a reason." Alexander cut her off, still not lifting his eyes. A heavy silence dropped over the room like a lead blanket. Hazel could hear her own heartbeat crashing inside her chest. 1 second, 5 seconds, 10 seconds. Then Alexander looked up, and his gray eyes drove straight into her like knives. "Crawford says you don't shake when you're threatened." He tilted his head, studying her. "Why aren't you afraid of me? Do you know who I am? Do you know what I've done to people who don't follow my rules?" Hazel drew a deep breath. She knew she should lower her head, should tremble, should beg for forgiveness. That was what an ordinary maid would do. But Hazel wasn't ordinary. She was a woman who had lost her mother, who was about to lose her brother, who had been wrung dry by life until there was nothing left to fear. "Because I've already lost everything, sir." Her voice was strangely calm. "A person with nothing left has nothing left to lose." Alexander stared at her. For a long time, his gaze picked at her, weighing her, as if he were trying to read every thought in her mind. Then something shifted in those gray eyes. Not softness, not pity, but a kind of recognition, as if he'd just seen something in her he hadn't expected. "Go," Alexander said, still cold, but less sharp. "But remember what I'm telling you. The next time I hear a report about you, you won't have the chance to stand here and explain. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir." Hazel lowered her head, turned, and walked out. Her legs were shaking, but she forced herself to walk steadily, until she was out of the room, out of the hallway, out of anyone's sight. Then she leaned her back against the cold stone wall, closed her eyes, and breathed in ragged gasps. She had just escaped death. But what filled her mind now wasn't relief. It was only one thought, spinning without end. Mia touches her ear. Mia is in pain. Something is wrong. Something is very wrong. And she had to find out what it was. That night, Hazel lay on the narrow single bed in the small servant's room, eyes wide open, staring at the pitch-black ceiling. She couldn't sleep. Mia's image kept rising in her mind, circling and circling like an old record stuck in the same groove. The child sitting alone in the garden. The child smiling as she watched the ballerina spin. The child touching her ear, her face tightening with pain. Touching her ear. Touching her ear. Touching her ear. Hazel sat bolt upright and pressed a hand to her forehead, which throbbed as if struck by a hammer. There was something familiar about that motion. About the way Mia kept reaching for her right ear, with that look of discomfort. Hazel had seen it before, and then the memory crashed over her like a tidal wave, dragging her back 8 years, to the days when she was a second-year nursing student at her training hospital. That year, Hazel was assigned to the ear, nose, and throat unit. A 10-year-old boy named Marcus was brought in by his frail, elderly grandmother. He had been diagnosed as congenitally deaf since he was 5, had gone through dozens of doctors, dozens of tests, and every one of them had reached the same conclusion. Damage to the auditory nerve, untreatable. His grandmother didn't have money to take him to more expensive clinics, so they came to the public hospital with one last, thin hope. Hazel was assigned to care for Marcus, while he waited to be seen, and she watched him all morning. The boy kept lifting his hand to touch his right ear, not scratching, not rubbing, but touching, as if checking whether something was inside. And every time he did, his face tightened with discomfort. Hazel reported what she'd noticed to the attending physician, a young man not long out of school. At first he brushed her off, saying the chart clearly stated congenital deafness and there was nothing more to check. But Hazel kept insisting, and finally the doctor agreed to look into the boy's ear with an otoscope. What they saw left them both frozen. Deep inside Marcus's right ear canal, a massive plug of earwax had hardened completely, sealing the canal like an enormous cork. It had been there for at least 5 years, building up and turning rigid over time. And not one doctor before them had discovered it because they'd trusted the existing diagnosis and never bothered to look again. 15 minutes. Just 15 minutes of a simple intervention, using specialized tools to remove the wax. And Marcus could hear. The boy heard his grandmother's voice for the first time in 5 years, and the two of them clung to each other and cried right there in the exam room. That was the day Hazel fell in love with nursing. That was the day she understood that sometimes miracles don't require magic, only eyes that truly look and a heart that truly cares. And that was also the last year she was able to stay in school, before her mother got sick, before her life collapsed. Hazel jumped off the bed, her heart racing out of control. It couldn't be. It couldn't be that similar. But what if it was true? What if Mia was like Marcus? 6 years, dozens of doctors from Mayo Clinic to Johns Hopkins, millions of dollars, and no one had found it. The next day, Hazel worked in a daze, moving like a sleepwalker. She waited, patient, until the chance came. That afternoon, when Mia was sitting on her familiar stone bench and no one else was around, Hazel passed by, pretending to gather dry leaves. She had already hidden the small flashlight in her pocket. The late afternoon sun slanted across the garden, creating the perfect angle of light. Hazel crouched beside Mia, smiled at her, then gently tilted the child's head to one side as if it were part of a game. Mia didn't resist. She trusted Hazel. Hazel clicked on the flashlight and shone it quickly into Mia's right ear, just for 1 or 2 seconds. Long enough to see. Her heart stopped. Deep inside Mia's ear canal, a thick black mass sat blocking the passage. It was far larger than the wax plug in Marcus's ear years ago. Harder. Darker. As if it had turned to stone after so many years. 6 years. That plug had been inside Mia's ear for 6 years. Through dozens of examinations by the top specialists in the world. Through millions of dollars spent on the most modern medical equipment, and not one of them had seen it. Hazel switched off the flashlight, patted Mia's shoulder lightly, then stood and walked away. She went straight into the servants' bathroom, locked the door, and leaned her back against the freezing brick wall. Her hands were shaking, her legs were shaking, her whole body trembled as if she were standing in the middle of a blizzard. She knew the truth now. Mia wasn't congenitally deaf. Mia didn't have permanent nerve damage. Mia had simply had a plug of wax blocking her ear for 6 years, and now the question was, what would Hazel do with that truth? The next 3 days were hell. Hazel worked like a machine, hands wiping, feet moving, but her mind was somewhere else entirely. She was fighting herself, a battle with no easy way out. Each night she lay on her bed, eyes fixed on the black ceiling, and her brain raced through every possible outcome. The first scenario. Tell Alexander Blackwood. She would ask to see him, kneel down, and say she believed his daughter wasn't congenitally deaf, that there was a wax mass in the child's ear that no one had discovered for 6 years. Hazel could almost picture the mafia boss's reaction. He would look at her like she was insane, a maid with no degree, no license, daring to claim she knew more than specialists from Mayo Clinic, from Johns Hopkins, from the most famous hospitals in the world. He would either laugh in her face, or explode in fury that she dared insult the intelligence of doctors he had paid millions of dollars. And then he would call in more experts to examine Mia. The same kind of people who had missed it for 6 years. The same people who might keep missing it because they didn't want to admit their mistake or their colleague's mistake. Or worse, Alexander would think Hazel was trying to get attention, trying to use his daughter for some ulterior purpose. And people who tried to get attention inside the Blackwood estate didn't usually end well. She would be fired on the spot, or handled the way the underworld handled people who knew too much. The second scenario. Intervene herself. Hazel had seen how the doctor removed the wax plug from Marcus's ear. In theory she could do it. But in theory, and in reality, were two completely different things. She wasn't a doctor. She didn't have specialized instruments. She didn't have an otoscope. She had only her hands and a little knowledge left over from the nursing education life had interrupted. If she was off by a millimeter, if she went too deep, if she damaged Mia's delicate eardrum, the child would be deaf for real. Deaf forever. Not because of wax, but because of Hazel's own hands. And if she was caught doing it, Alexander Blackwood would kill her. Not as a figure of speech. Not as an exaggeration. Kill her for real, with his bare hands or a gun. She didn't know, but she was certain she wouldn't live to tell the story. The third scenario. Stay silent. Keep working. Keep earning. Keep pretending she knew nothing. Let Mia go on living in a world without sound. keep hurting every time she touched her ear, keep being alone in this vast mansion for the rest of her life, and Hazel would live with guilt, with the thought, I knew the truth and I did nothing, haunting her every night until she died. Then Hazel thought of Tommy. Her brother was lying in that damp rented room, waiting for dialysis money every week, waiting for his sister to save his life. If Hazel died, who would take care of Tommy? No one. He would die too. The two of them would die together. One because the mafia killed her. One because there was no one left to pay the hospital bills. I can't risk it, Tommy. Hazel whispered into the dark, tears streaming down her cheeks. I can't. But every time she closed her eyes she saw Mia again. The child sitting alone in the garden. The child touching her ear and flinching in pain. The child smiling as she watched the ballerina spin inside her mother's music box. The child leaving crude drawings of suns and stars. An 8-year-old girl, lonely, hurting, abandoned by the entire world in silence. And Hazel was the only one who knew the truth. On the third night, Hazel made her decision. On her day off, she left the estate, walked to a pharmacy a few miles away, and bought a high-quality medical tweezers. The kind with a fine, sharp tip, designed to grasp small objects with precision. She brought it back to her room, sterilized it thoroughly with alcohol, then wrapped it in a clean cloth and hid it in her pocket. She would carry it with her at all times. She would wait for an opening, a perfect moment when no one was around, when she could be alone with Mia long enough to do what needed to be done. The moment would come, and when it did, she would act, even if it cost her life, even if it left Tommy alone in the world. Because there were things worse than death, and living with the guilt of knowing and doing nothing was one of them. On the 21st day at the Blackwood estate, Hazel was wiping down the first-floor corridor, rag in hand, her mind still spinning around the image of the medical tweezers hidden in her pocket, when the phone in her pants began to vibrate. She glanced at the screen and her heart clenched instantly. Northwestern Memorial Hospital. They never called unless something was wrong. Hazel hurried into a shadowed corner, answered, her voice shaking. Ms. Morgan? The nurse on the other end sounded familiar. The same woman who'd been caring for Tommy for months. I have news about your brother. Good news and bad news. Hazel held her breath. The good news is we've found a kidney match for Tommy. That's very rare with his blood type, you know. We've been waiting a long time for this opportunity. Hazel's heart hammered. A match. After months of waiting, after night of praying, there was finally hope. But the nurse didn't stop. The bad news is, Tommy's condition has worsened suddenly this past week. His kidneys are failing faster than we expected. He needs the transplant immediately. He can't wait any longer. Hazel felt her knees go weak. Then do it now, please. That's the problem, Miss Morgan. The nurse's voice turned grave. To hold this kidney and proceed with surgery, you need to put down a deposit of $50,000 within 72 hours. If you can't, by policy, the kidney will be transferred to the next patient on the waiting list. I'm so sorry, but that's hospital policy. $50,000, 72 hours. The numbers echoed in Hazel's head like a death bell. She didn't have $50,000. She didn't have $5,000. A full year's salary at the Blackwood estate wouldn't even cover it. Who could she borrow from? No one. She had no family, no friends, no one in this world except Tommy. Ms. Morgan, are you still there? Yes, Hazel whispered, her voice dry. I'll try. She ended the call and stood there in the empty corridor, her body numb. Then her legs carried her automatically to the staff bathroom. She locked the door, pressed her back to the cold brick wall, and collapsed. Tears poured out beyond her control. Hazel sobbed, choking. But she didn't dare make a sound, afraid someone would hear. She covered her mouth with both hands, her shoulders shaking in waves, and cried the way she'd never been allowed to cry. Tommy was going to die. Her brother, her only brother, the boy she'd promised her mother she would protect at any cost, was going to die because she didn't have $50,000. She thought of dropping to her knees in front of Alexander Blackwood and begging him for the money, but the thought was crushed almost as soon as it formed. Owing money to the mafia was selling your soul to the devil. She'd heard enough stories in the kitchen about people who borrowed from Mr. Blackwood, and how it ended. They became slaves for life. Or worse. No. She couldn't take that road. But what other road was there? Hazel sat in the bathroom for nearly an hour, crying until there were no tears left, until her body was drained, and her mind went blank. Then she washed her face, looked into the mirror at her reddened eyes and hollow cheeks, and stepped back out to keep working. because she had no other choice. That evening, Chicago's sky began to turn a dirty gray. By night, the first snowflakes fell. And by midnight, the biggest blizzard in 10 years slammed into the city. The wind howled at 60 miles an hour, whipping against the estate's windows as if it meant to tear them apart. Snow fell thick and heavy, piling up like white walls, covering the streets, freezing every route out. Alexander Blackwood was stuck downtown because a business meeting had dragged on. Mia's nanny asked to leave early before the roads iced over completely. And Crawford agreed. The other servants huddled down in the basement area where the heating was concentrated. The power flickered again and again, and the backup generator growled like a wounded beast. The Blackwood estate sank into darkness, lit only by the pale glow of a few emergency lamps and the roar of the storm outside. Hazel lay on her bed in her small room, eyes on the ceiling, her mind empty. She had cried herself dry. She had thought through every option until there was nothing left. She had nothing. And then, through the howl of the wind and the slap of snow against glass, she heard another sound. Crying, ragged, afraid, echoing down from the third floor. Mia's room. Hazel jerked upright, her heart racing. The child was alone up there. No nanny. No father. No one. In the night of a roaring blizzard, in a pitch-dark room, an 8-year-old girl was crying all by herself. A storm night, just like the night 6 years ago. The night Catherine was killed. The night Mia sat beside her mother's body and screamed until she lost the ability to hear. And now the girl was living that nightmare again. Alone. Hazel stood at the foot of the staircase, staring up toward the third floor, black as ink. Mia's crying drifted down, ragged and frightened, like a plea for help rising from the bottom of a deep, endless ravine. In the darkness, that crying sounded even more mournful, more painful, more crushingly lonely. Crawford's rules rang in Hazel's head like an alarm bell. Do not go up to the third floor. Do not interact with the child. The one before you got too curious. And she doesn't work in Chicago anymore. Crawford. Alexander. Death. The three of them spun through Hazel's mind like a hellish whirlpool. If she climbed those steps, she might never come back down. Not on her own feet. Maybe in a body bag. But that crying, the choked sobs of an 8-year-old alone in a storm night. In a dark room, with the memory of the night her mother died 6 years ago closing in around her. Hazel couldn't turn away. She placed her foot on the first step. Her heart was beating wildly, so hard she could hear it echoing in her ears. The second step. The third. Each step felt like walking into her own death sentence. The staircase stretched on forever through the dark, lit only by the weak flicker of a few emergency lamps, blinking like ghostly eyes. The storm wind howled outside, battering the windows, shaking the entire mansion. But Hazel kept moving. She climbed until she stood before the door to Mia's room. She pushed it open. The room opened up before her. And what she saw inside made her heart feel crushed in someone's fist. Mia was curled on the bed, small as a wounded animal trying to fold into itself for protection. Her hands were clamped over her head, her whole body trembling without stop. She was crying, but not out loud, because she didn't know she was making sound, because she lived in a world without noise. There were only tears tracking down her cheeks, and the small body jerking with each wave of silent sobbing. Around the room, dozens of photographs of Catherine stared down from the walls. Catherine smiling, Catherine holding Mia when she was a baby, Catherine on her wedding day with Alexander. Catherine, 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 the mother who had died in a storm night 6 years ago, leaving her little girl alone in a silent world. And tonight, with another storm screaming beyond the window, Mia was reliving that nightmare. Alone, with no one beside her. Hazel stepped closer, and then she saw something that turned her blood cold. The skin around Mia's right ear was raw and red, slightly swollen, as if something inside was pressing with frantic force, trying to push its way out. The wax plug. It was moving. Maybe the air pressure had shifted because of the storm. Maybe it was something else. But it was hurting Mia, hurting her so badly she couldn't bear it. Hazel sat down beside the bed and gently set a hand on Mia's shoulder. Mia jolted, opened her eyes, and for the first second, her face was filled with terror. Then she recognized who was sitting in front of her. The red-haired woman. The one who had fixed her mother's music box. The one who had left wildflowers in a heart-shaped leaf. The only person in the world who truly saw her. Mia threw herself into Hazel, small arms wrapping tight around her, clinging the way you cling to a life raft in a stormy sea. She cried into Hazel's chest, crying without sound, but Hazel could feel every tremor of that tiny body. Every hot tear soaking through her shirt. Hazel held her close, stroked her long black hair, and fought back her own tears. Then she saw Mia lift a hand to cover her right ear, her small face pale with pain. She was hurting. Hurting so badly she couldn't stand it. Hurting so much she forgot even her fear of the storm night. Hazel closed her eyes. In her mind she saw Tommy, lying in a hospital bed with his sickly pale skin, and his weak smile. He needed her. If she died tonight, Tommy would die too. Then she saw Mia, an 8-year-old child alone, in her arms, in pain, terrified, needing someone to save her. Hazel couldn't save them both, but she could save one person right now. In this moment, if she dared. God, she whispered into the darkness, her voice shaking. If I die tonight, please take care of Tommy. Please send someone to him. But I can't let this child hurt for one more second. I can't. Hazel opened her eyes. Her hand slipped into her pocket, where the medical tweezers, sterilized with care, had been waiting. She drew it out and looked at it in the weak light of the emergency lamp. A small pair of tweezers. A simple tool. But in her hands, it could be a miracle, or a death sentence. Tonight, Hazel Morgan would do what was right. Even if it cost her everything. Even if it cost her her own life. Hazel gently loosened Mia from her arms, then knelt in front of her at eye level. She needed Mia to understand what she was about to do. She needed the child's permission. Even if Mia was only 8 years old. With slow, careful gestures, Hazel pointed to Mia's right ear. Then she lifted the tweezers so the girl could see them. Then she mimed, sliding the tweezers into an ear and pulling something out, as if removing an object. Mia watched her, wide eyes slowly understanding. And immediately, fear flooded the child's face. She scooted back, shaking her head. Both hands clamped over her ear as if to protect it. Hazel understood. Mia had been through too much. Too many examinations. Too many cold instruments pushed into her ear. Too many rounds of hope followed by disappointment. Every time it hurt. Every time it was useless. And now a woman wanted to do the same thing again. But Hazel wasn't a stranger. She was the one who had fixed Mia's mother's music box. She was the one who left wildflowers in a heart-shaped leaf. She was the one who traded clumsy drawings and stolen smiles. She was the only person in this world who truly saw Mia. Not as a disabled child. Not as the mafia boss's daughter. But as an 8-year-old girl. Who was lonely, and needed to be loved. Hazel looked straight into Mia's eyes and didn't say a word. Because she knew Mia couldn't hear. She only looked at her. With all her sincerity, all her tenderness, all the promise that she would never hurt her. And Mia looked back. For a long time, then slowly, she lowered her hands from her ear and nodded. A small nod. But it was everything Hazel needed. Hazel switched on the bedside lamp, and adjusted it so the light shone directly into Mia's right ear. She signaled for the girl to lie down and tilt her head to the left. Mia obeyed, her eyes still fixed on Hazel, still trusting her. Even though the fear hadn't vanished completely, Hazel drew a deep breath, trying to steady herself. Her hand was shaking. Shaking so hard she could see the tweezers tip trembling in the lamplight. Don't shake, she whispered to herself. Don't shake. One slip and it's over. One slip and she'll be deaf for real. One slip and you'll kill her last hope. She took a few more breaths, until her hand steadied enough to go on. Then she guided the tweezers in. Mia's ear canal was smaller than Hazel expected. Darker than she expected. The lamp's light only reached so far. Hazel had to rely on touch, on instinct, on what she still remembered from the nursing program she never finished. The tweezer's tip met something hard. It was there, deep inside, black and dense like a lump of coal, clinging to the canal wall as if it had grown roots there over 6 years. Hazel pinched gently and tried to pull it free. Nothing moved. The wax was hard as cement, refusing to give even a millimeter. Hazel tightened her grip, increasing pressure slowly. Mia's face tightened, a small groan slipping from her throat. Though she didn't know she was making sound, sweat began to bead on Hazel's forehead and run into her eyes, stinging. She didn't dare lift a hand to wipe it away, afraid of losing focus. She kept going. Pinch, pull, feeling the wax slowly begin to loosen inside the canal. It was shifting. It was wobbling. It was almost out. Hazel pulled once more. Stronger, more decisive. And then, with a wet sound that made her feel sick, the plug came free. It sat clamped in the tweezer's tip, pitch black, thick, and heavy. Almost the size of a large pea, coated with a glossy yellow mucus. 6 years. This had been in Mia's ear for 6 years, sealing the canal, stealing her hearing, and not one doctor in the world had found it disgusting and beautiful. Because it was out. Hazel set the tweezers down and looked at Mia. The girl was still lying on her side, eyes squeezed shut, bracing for the next wave of pain. But the pain didn't come. Instead, 1 second passed. 2. Then Mia opened her eyes. And something had changed in them. A stunned wonder, confusion, as if she had stepped into a completely new world. Mia sat up as if jolted by electricity, her head turning toward the window where the blizzard was raging outside, wind howling, snow slamming against glass, trees bending, the wild, chaotic sound of nature in fury. And Mia was hearing all of it. For the first time in 6 years, her lips moved, her throat vibrated, struggling to form a sound she had never truly learned to control. And then a word came out, hoarse, awkward, like someone speaking for the very first time. Wind! Wind! Hazel cried. Tears burst out like a flood, running down her cheeks, dripping onto her hands, onto the tweezers smeared with blood and mucus. She wrapped her arms around Mia, held her tight, and wept into the girl's long black hair. You can hear, she sobbed, her voice breaking. Dear God, you can hear. You can hear now, Mia. You can hear. Mia lifted a hand and touched her throat, where she could feel a strange vibration each time she tried to make a sound. For 6 years, she had lived in a completely silent world, where everything was wholly images with no noise attached. But now everything was different. She looked around the room as if she had just landed on an entirely new planet. The heater humming in the corner, the wind shrieking at the window, screaming as if it wanted to tear the night apart, snow striking the walls in waves, again and again. The sound of her own heart beating in her chest. Thump, thump. A sound she had never even known existed. Everything was new. Everything was miraculous. Everything was so overwhelming that Mia didn't know how to react. She turned to Hazel, wide eyes full of wonder and a little fear. Her lips moved, trying to shape sound the way she had a moment ago. Ha, Zell. Her voice was hoarse and clumsy, like someone learning to speak from the beginning. What is that sound? Hazel cried and smiled at the same time, tears streaming down her cheeks while a radiant smile held on her lips. She hugged Mia tight, stroked the girl's long black hair, and whispered into her ear, into the ear that could finally hear. That sound, Mia. That's the world you've missed for 6 years, and now you can hear it. You can hear everything. Mia hugged Hazel back, small arms locking around her neck, and for the first time, she cried out loud. Little sobs slipped from her throat, awkward and unfamiliar, but real in every second. But that miracle didn't last. Bang! The bedroom door flew open with a piercing crash. Hazel and Mia both jerked and turned toward it. And there, in the doorway, stood Alexander Blackwood. He was home early. Somehow he had pushed through the monstrous blizzard raging outside, broken through every barrier to get back here. Maybe it was a father's instinct. Maybe it was the unease of knowing his daughter was alone in a storm night. Maybe it was simply fate. Whatever the reason, he was there, and his gray eyes swept over the scene with the speed of a predator. His daughter on the bed, face wet with tears, a faint bleed from her right ear, a thin line of blood trailing down her neck, and the maid he had warned never to go near his daughter, kneeling beside the bed, holding tweezers smeared with blood. Alexander's face twisted. A vein rose at his temple, pounding wildly. His gray eyes darkened into storm black, and his body shook with the rage erupting inside him. You. His voice was low, dangerous, like the growl of a lion before it strikes. Dead. He stepped into the room, each footfall heavy as a sledgehammer. What? His hand curled into a fist, the knuckles turning white. 2. He stopped in front of Hazel, glaring down at her with a look that could burn through anything. My daughter? Each word came out like a knife, slicing the air, shaking the room itself. Hazel opened her mouth, trying to explain, trying to tell him what she had done and why. But before she could get out a single word, Mia was faster. She turned toward her father. For the first time in 6 years, she heard his voice. Deep, loud, terrifying, full of power and fury. It was the voice of Alexander Blackwood, the most infamous mafia boss in Chicago, the man the entire city feared. But to Mia, it wasn't the mafia boss's voice. It was her father's voice. The voice she hadn't been allowed to hear for 6 years. The voice whose sound she had forgotten, remembering only the sight of his lips moving every time he sat beside her bed and spoke words she never heard. And now she could hear him. Mia wasn't afraid. Her lips moved, her throat vibrating, struggling to form a sound she had only learned to use minutes ago. One word came out, shaking, clumsy, but more beautiful than any symphony on earth. D? Alexander Blackwood went perfectly still, as if someone had pressed pause on the entire universe. His fist loosened. The rage on his face dissolved, replaced by an expression Hazel had never seen on the mafia boss. Shock, disbelief, and hope. Hope trembling and fragile, like a candle in the wind. Daddy, loud, Mia said again, her face tightening as if the sound was so big it was giving her a headache. Very loud. Alexander staggered as if someone had punched him straight in the chest. His legs seemed to lose all strength, and he lurched toward the bed and dropped to his knees in front of his daughter, both hands gripping Mia's shoulders as if she might vanish the moment he let go. What did you just say? His voice was trembling. Nothing like the snarling fury from seconds earlier. Say it again. Say it again, baby, please. Say it again for Daddy. Mia looked at her father, wide-eyed, still stunned by the new world of sound opening around her. She lifted her small hand and touched his cheek, feeling the roughness of a man who hadn't shaved for days because he'd been worried about the storm. Daddy, she said, her voice still hoarse and clumsy, but clearer than before. Mia. Here. Mia can hear Daddy. And Alexander Blackwood, the most infamous mafia boss in Chicago, the man who had strangled a traitor with his bare hands, the man whose name made the whole city afraid, the man who had never cried in front of anyone since the night Catherine died, cried. The tears came without control, spilling down the cold, sharp planes of his face, falling onto the small hand his daughter kept against his cheek. He pulled Mia into his arms and held her tight, as if holding the most precious treasure he'd believed he'd lost forever, and had now been given back. 6 years. 6 years he had waited for this moment. 6 years he had spent millions of dollars, flown across the world, begged every doctor, every specialist. 6 years he had lived in despair, watching his daughter drown in silence, and being unable to do anything. And now she was speaking. She was calling him. She was hearing. But then, still holding Mia, Alexander's eyes drifted to his daughter's right ear. Blood. A thin line of blood seeping from the canal, trailing down her neck, staining the white collar of her nightgown. His heart clenched as if in a fist. His gaze snapped to the side, and he saw Hazel, still kneeling beside the bed, still holding the tweezers smeared with blood and thick black slime. The fury exploded back to life, 100 times stronger than before. A father's protective instinct swallowed every shred of reason, every logical thought. He saw only one thing. Someone had made his daughter bleed. Jonah! Alexander's roar shook the mansion like thunder, ripping through walls and doors, echoing into every corner. Within seconds, heavy footsteps pounded in the hallway, and Jonah, the head bodyguard, a huge man with a scarred face and a killer's eyes, appeared in the doorway. Take her, Alexander snarled, stabbing a finger at Hazel. Lock her up. Now. Hazel opened her mouth, trying to explain. Mr. Blackwood, please listen to me. Shut up. Alexander swung toward her, eyes blazing. You touched my daughter. You made her bleed. What do you think you are, that you dare put your hands on my child? I was only trying to help. Help? Alexander let out a bitter laugh, cold as ice. You call jamming tweezers into my daughter's ear help? Do you know what I can do to you? Before Hazel could say another word, Mia screamed. It was her first scream in 6 years. A sound that ripped through the air, raw with fear and desperation. No, Daddy, no! She clung to her father's arm, trying to pull him back. She help Mia, don't hurt her. But Alexander didn't hear. Or he didn't want to. Rage blurred everything, and all he could see was blood on Mia's ear. All he could see was the tweezers in the maid's hand. Jonah entered the room with 2 other guards. They grabbed Hazel, wrenched her arms behind her back, and snapped cold handcuffs tight around her wrists. Hazel didn't fight. She knew fighting was useless. She could only hope Alexander would calm down, hope he would examine Mia's ear and recognize the truth. Hope the miracle she had just created would save her from death. As they dragged her out of the room, Hazel turned her head and looked straight into Alexander's eyes. Her voice was strangely calm, as if she had already accepted her fate. Check your daughter's ear, Mr. Blackwood. Check it carefully. Then you'll understand what I did. Then she was pulled away, down the hallway, down the stairs, through dark passages she hadn't even known existed in this mansion. They took her into the basement, a place sunlight never touched, where dampness and bone-deep cold soaked everything. They opened a heavy iron door, shoved her inside, and slammed it shut. Darkness swallowed her. Hazel sank to the cold concrete floor and leaned her back against the wet wall. This was where the mafia boss kept special guests, traitors, enemies, the people Alexander Blackwood wanted to talk to, before they vanished from the world forever. And now she was here, in the dark. Hazel closed her eyes. She thought of Tommy, her brother lying in the hospital waiting for a transplant that might never come. She thought of Mia, of the girl's smile when she heard the wind, of the trembling daddy that had slipped from her small mouth. She had done it. She had saved Mia, and now all she could do was wait for death, or wait for another miracle. 2 hours passed in darkness. 2 hours of Hazel sitting on the freezing concrete floor, her back against a damp wall, her mind empty. She didn't know how she would die, whether she'd be shot or strangled, thrown into the Chicago River, or buried alive somewhere no one would ever find. She only knew she would die, and Tommy would die with her, and everything would end. Then, the iron door opened. Light poured in like a blinding wave, forcing Hazel to squint. Jonah stood in the doorway, his scarred face showing no emotion. "Come with me," he said flatly. "The boss wants to see you." They led her upstairs, not to Alexander's study, but to a room she had never seen before. The estate's medical room. It was flooded with fluorescent light, its walls spotless white, its shelves lined with modern medical equipment she had only ever seen in the most expensive hospitals. And in the center of that room stood 3 people. Mia, sitting on an exam table, big eyes still red-rimmed but no longer afraid. A middle-aged man in a white coat, his stern face gone pale from something he had just discovered. And Alexander Blackwood, standing as still as a statue, his face white as a corpse, gray eyes fixed on an open laptop screen on the table. The man in the white coat turned when Hazel entered. It was Dr. Mitchell, the Blackwood family's private physician. The doctor, the servants whispered, had taken care of Alexander and Mia for years. He looked Hazel up and down, then turned back to Alexander, his voice trembling. "Alexander." "I examined Mia's ear carefully," he said, each word coming out slowly, as if he were holding back something fierce. "Her eardrum is completely intact. There's no damage at all. Perfect. This girl." He turned and looked at Hazel, astonishment in his eyes. "She has hands as precise as a formally trained surgeon. She put tweezers into the ear canal of an 8-year-old child, in the weak light of a bedside lamp, with no specialized equipment, no assistance, and removed a wax plug that had turned to stone, without leaving a single scratch on the eardrum. If she'd been off by 1 millimeter, just 1 millimeter, Mia would be deaf for real and forever. But she wasn't off." Alexander said nothing. He stood rigid, staring at the laptop screen. Dr. Mitchell drew a deep breath and went on, his voice beginning to shake with anger. "But that isn't what makes me angriest, Alexander. After examining Mia, I reviewed her entire medical file from the past years. All the records from Mayo Clinic, from Johns Hopkins, from Cleveland Clinic, from the most famous hospitals in the world you took her to." Dr. Mitchell stepped to the laptop and rotated the screen toward Alexander. "Look here." He pointed to a scanned ear image from 3 years earlier, from Cleveland Clinic. "Look at this dark area in the canal. Do you see it?" Alexander stared, his eyes slowly widening. "They saw the obstruction," Dr. Mitchell said, his voice rising with outrage. "Right here, in the chart, they labeled it a complex anatomical anomaly, and intervention not recommended. But instead of telling you the truth, instead of recommending a simple procedure to remove it, they coded it as permanent auditory nerve damage due to psychological trauma. They lied to you, Alexander. They knew your daughter wasn't congenitally deaf. They knew it was only a wax plug blocking her ear, and they lied. They knew?" Alexander whispered, his voice hollow, like a dead man's. "Why?" "Because you're a whale, Alexander," Dr. Mitchell answered bitterly. "In medicine, that's what they call ultra-rich patients like you. Whales. Big fat whales meant to be milked. What does permanent nerve damage mean? It means lifelong treatment, expensive medication every month, weekly therapy sessions, regular follow-ups, flights to specialty clinics in Europe, in Japan, anywhere they want. They didn't want to cure your daughter, Alexander. They wanted to drain you, forever." A deadly silence settled over the room. Alexander trembled, his whole body shaking as if caught in an earthquake. 6 years. 6 years his daughter lived in silence. 6 years she touched her ear and hurt. 6 years he spent millions of dollars, flew across the world, begged every doctor, and all of it, had been a performance staged by people in white coats, people he had trusted, people he had handed his daughter's life to. They had deceived him. They had let his daughter suffer. They had stolen 6 years of Mia's childhood, all for money. Alexander turned to Hazel. She still stood between two guards, her wrists still cuffed, but her eyes weren't afraid anymore. She had done what she needed to do. Even if she died, she wouldn't regret it. You. Alexander opened his mouth, his voice rough, as if every word had to fight its way through a wall in his throat. How did you know? How did you know what the best doctors in the world didn't know? Or pretended not to know? Hazel looked straight into Alexander's eyes, and this time she wasn't afraid anymore. She had faced death in that damp, lightless basement. She had accepted that she might never see Tommy again. She had let everything go. And when someone has let go of everything, there's nothing left to fear. I used to be a nursing student, she said, her voice strangely calm. 3rd year, before I had to drop out. During my hospital training, I saw a similar case. A 10-year-old boy, diagnosed as congenitally deaf for 5 years. No one questioned the diagnosis. But I noticed he kept touching his ear and tightening his face as if he was in pain. I told the attending doctor. They checked again, and they found a hardened wax plug sealing the ear canal. 15 minutes later, the boy could hear. She paused for a second, and drew a deep breath. When I came to work here, I saw Mia. I saw her touching her right ear over and over, in pain. Exactly like that boy years ago. I paid attention, I watched, and I recognized it as a sign. No one else noticed. Or maybe they noticed and stopped caring a long time ago. To them, Mia was just a deaf child, and whatever a deaf child does gets treated as normal. Alexander stood there listening, his face pale and blank. Then he asked, his voice rough, "Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you come to me and tell me what you suspected?" Hazel almost laughed, but she held it back. "Because you wouldn't have believed me," she answered bluntly, without dressing it up. "Who am I? A maid. No degree. No license. No reputation. And I'm supposed to walk in and say I know more than doctors from Mayo Clinic, from Johns Hopkins, from hospitals where the consultation fee alone equals my entire yearly pay." She shook her head. "You would have thought I was crazy. Or you would have thought I was trying to get attention. Trying to use your daughter for something. You would have called in more specialists. The same people who ignored it for 6 years. And they would have reaffirmed the old diagnosis. Then you would have fired me. Or worse." She looked straight at him. "I would have died before I could explain anything." Silence filled the room. No one spoke. Dr. Mitchell stood rigid beside the laptop. Jonah and the guards stayed tense, hands resting on their gun grips, ready to move on any command. Mia sat on the exam table, wide eyes moving between her father and Hazel, not fully understanding what was happening but sensing the strain in the air. And Alexander, the most infamous mafia boss in Chicago, stood there like stone, gray eyes fixed on Hazel, with an expression she couldn't read. Then he stepped closer. Jonah and the guards tightened instantly, fingers curling around their weapons, ready to intervene. They didn't know what their boss would do. Hit her. Kill her. Anything was possible with Alexander Blackwood. But the mafia boss didn't do what they expected. Alexander Blackwood lowered his head, bowed his head to a maid whose wrists still carried the marks of cuffs, bowed his head to the woman he'd ordered thrown into the basement only hours earlier, bowed his head to Hazel Morgan, a young woman with nothing but her hands and a courageous heart. "I almost killed the only person who could save my daughter," he said, his voice rough, as if every word had to push through a boulder in his throat. "I looked at you and I saw a threat. I looked at a maid's uniform and I saw someone beneath me. Someone not worth listening to. I looked at your hands and I saw them as dirty, as dangerous, as something that was hurting my child." He lifted his head, and Hazel saw his eyes reddened and shining with tears. "But those hands did what my millions couldn't do. Those hands gave my daughter her hearing back. Those hands saved Mia." "I'm sorry, Hazel Morgan," he said. And it was the first time in his life that Alexander Blackwood, a mafia boss, apologized to anyone who wasn't his daughter. Hazel stood there, stunned. She had prepared for death. She had prepared for torture. She had prepared for the worst. But she hadn't prepared for this. She hadn't prepared for the most infamous mafia boss in Chicago to bow his head and apologize to her. You don't need to apologize, she stammered, not knowing what to say. You were protecting your daughter. Any father would do the same. I almost killed my child's savior. Alexander shook his head, bitterness in his voice. That isn't protection. That's blindness, he signaled to Jonah. The head bodyguard stepped forward, drew out a key, and unlocked Hazel's cuffs. Hazel rubbed her wrists where the cold metal had left red marks on her skin. Alexander took her hand, the hand that had once strangled traitors, the hand that had held a gun and killed enemies, now holding hers gently as if it were something precious and fragile. Do you have family who needs help, Hazel? He asked, his voice steady and serious. Tell me. Everything. Anything you need, I'll do. Hazel hesitated. Alexander's question echoed inside her head, and she didn't know how to answer. Should she tell the truth? Should she tell a mafia boss about Tommy? About the brother who was fading in a hospital bed? About the $50,000 she didn't have? About the kidney that would be given to someone else if she couldn't pay within the next 48 hours? But then she thought, what did she have left to lose? She had almost died tonight. She had faced death in that damp, lightless basement. She had let go of everything. And now, if there was a chance, even a small one, to save Tommy, she had to take it. I have a brother, she began, her voice trembling. Tommy. He's 22. He's had end-stage kidney failure for 2 years. 3 times a week he has to go through dialysis to stay alive, and the cost of it eats almost everything I earn. She drew a deep breath, trying to hold back the tears rising fast. Yesterday, the hospital called me. They said they found a kidney match for Tommy. That's very rare with his blood type, but to hold that kidney and proceed with the surgery, I need to put down a deposit of $50,000 within 72 hours. Now there's less than 48 hours left. If I don't have the money, the kidney will be transferred to another patient on the waiting list. And Tommy? Her voice caught. Tommy will die. Silence. Alexander looked at her, gray eyes giving away nothing. Hazel went on. As if once the lock had been broken she couldn't stop. That's why I work here. The pay is 5 times what it is anywhere else. I knew this was a mafia boss's estate. I knew the risks. I heard the stories about people who vanished after working here, but I didn't care. She looked him straight in the eye. I don't care who you are, what you do, how many people you've killed. I only need money. I only need Tommy to live. He's the only family I have left in this world. Alexander listened without interrupting. His face stayed unreadable. But those gray eyes seemed to be thinking hard. When Hazel finished, he stood up without a word, pulled his phone from the inside pocket of his suit jacket, and dialed. Hazel watched him, not knowing what he was doing. Maybe he was calling someone to verify her story. Maybe he was calling a guard to take her somewhere else. She didn't know. All she could do was stand there and wait. Carter, Alexander said into the phone, his voice cold and decisive. The same voice he used when giving orders to his men. Wire $500,000 to Northwestern Memorial Hospital right now. Patient name Tommy Morgan. Kidney transplant surgery. I want the best surgeon in that hospital on the case. VIP room, best post-op care. I want him treated like he's my son. Finish all paperwork in 2 hours. Call me back when it's done. He ended the call as if he'd just ordered pizza for dinner. Hazel stood frozen, unable to believe what she'd heard. $500,000. He had just ordered a transfer of $500,000, not the $50,000 she needed. 500,000. 10 times as much. Enough to cover not just the surgery, but the entire recovery, medication, and maybe years of treatment afterward. I didn't ask you for that, she stammered, voice shaking. I didn't ask you for anything. I know. Alexander turned back to her, looking at her with an expression she had never seen on him. Not cold, not threatening, only a deep, honest respect. You didn't ask. That's exactly why I'm giving. He stepped closer, his voice lowering. You risked your life to save my daughter, Hazel. You knew who I am. You knew what I can do to you. You knew if you were caught, you would die, and you still did it, not for money, not to be rewarded, but because you couldn't watch a child in pain and do nothing. He paused. And when I almost killed you, you didn't hate me. You even said I was only protecting my child. You forgave me when I didn't deserve forgiveness. You're the kind of person I've never met in my life. Hazel Morgan. Alexander sat down in the chair beside the exam table and looked at her seriously. You're not a maid anymore. Starting tomorrow, you'll be Mia's personal caregiver. You'll stay by her side, help her learn to speak, learn to listen, learn to live with the world she has only just discovered. Your salary will match what you've done and what you're going to do. He stood and stepped even closer. And Hazel? For the first time, something softened in the cold gray eyes of the Chicago mafia boss. Don't call me sir anymore. Alexander. Just Alexander. That night, after everything settled, after Mia had fallen asleep in her room with a smile on her lips, after the mansion returned to quiet, Hazel sat in her new room, a room 3 times larger than the old servant's room, with a soft bed, warm blankets, and a window overlooking the garden. She held her phone with trembling hands and called Northwestern Memorial Hospital. Hello? My name is Hazel Morgan. I'm calling to ask about patient Tommy Morgan. Ms. Morgan. The nurse's voice on the other end came bright with excitement. We just received the payment. $500,000. Everything is cleared. Tommy's surgery will be tomorrow morning. The department chief will perform it personally. He'll receive the best care. You can rest assured. Tears spilled out. Hazel cried, unable to stop, crying from relief, from happiness, from gratitude, from every feeling she had held down for years. Can I talk to Tommy? He's half awake from the medication. But go ahead. He'll be able to hear you. Hazel heard the phone being held to her brother's ear. She drew a deep breath and tried to steady her voice. Tommy? Can you hear me? Sis. Hazel? Tommy's voice was weak and foggy. It's me, Tommy. Listen to me. Tears ran down her cheeks. You're going to live, Tommy. You're getting the transplant tomorrow. You're going to get better. I promise you. You're going to live. 3 months passed like a dream. Tommy's surgery was a success the very next morning after that fateful blizzard night. The operation lasted 6 hours. And when the department chief stepped out of the operating room with a smile on his face, Hazel fainted in the hospital hallway from the shock of relief. The new kidney functioned perfectly. Tommy's body showed no sign of rejection. And now, after 3 months of recovery in a VIP room at Northwestern Memorial Hospital, the 22-year-old young man could sit up, walk around, and had even begun light exercise under the guidance of a physical therapist Alexander hired privately. Alexander paid every bill in full. Not only for the surgery but also for 3 months of post-op care, medication, and even the salary of a private nurse assigned to Tommy around the clock. When Hazel tried to thank him, Alexander only waved it away and said, "That's a debt I'll never be able to repay." And Mia, the 8-year-old girl who had lived in silence for 6 years, was now learning to speak with one of the top speech-language therapists in America. A woman Alexander brought in from Boston for an outrageously high salary. But the strange thing was that no matter how skilled the specialist was, Mia always made the fastest progress when she was with Hazel. Maybe because Hazel didn't push her. Didn't turn every lesson into a stressful test. She only talked with Mia, played with her, read books aloud, and let the child copy naturally. Learn naturally. The first word Mia spoke clearly, without stumbling or slurring, wasn't Daddy the way Alexander had hoped. It was Hazel. The girl had practiced it for days, wanting it perfect, wanting the woman who saved her to hear her name said correctly. And when Mia finally said Hazel with clear confidence, they both cried. The Blackwood estate was no longer silent like a tomb. There was piano music drifting from the living room every afternoon. Mia practicing because she was so captivated by sound that she wanted to create her own. There was laughter, rare but real, coming from Mia's room when Hazel told a joke or when the two of them played together. There were footsteps running down the hall, and Mia's voice calling, "Hazel, Hazel," loud enough to echo through the mansion whenever she wanted to show off something new she had just learned. And most miraculous of all, the servants began to change too. They no longer moved like ghosts. They started talking to one another, started smiling when they saw the little mistress dart past, started daring to lift their eyes instead of keeping their heads bowed every minute of the day. Some of them even dared to nod at Hazel in the hallway, something unimaginable only a few months earlier. Alexander changed as well. He came home earlier and no longer vanished until midnight the way he used to. He ate dinner with Mia every day, sitting at the head of the long table and listening as his daughter told him about her day, in a voice that was still slow and sometimes ungrammatical, but bursting with excitement. He learned sign language to communicate with Mia in the moments she was tired and didn't want to speak, even though she could hear and talk now. He even began learning piano with her. though the fingers that had once crushed enemies' throats were so clumsy that Mia would burst into laughter whenever he hit the wrong note. And sometimes, when he thought no one noticed, Alexander's gray gaze lingered on Hazel longer than it needed to. Watching her laugh with Mia, watching her read to his daughter, watching her exist in his space as if she belonged there long before he ever knew her name. One night, after Mia had fallen asleep, Hazel sat in the mansion's library reading an old novel she had found on a shelf. The room was quiet, filled only with the crackle of firewood in the hearth, and the dancing light on walls lined with books. Then the door opened. Alexander stepped in without a word, and sat down in the armchair beside her. This was something he had never done with anyone. To sit beside someone just to sit. Not to give orders or threaten or negotiate. "You know, Hazel," he began, his voice low and tired, "you're the first person in 6 years who hasn't been afraid of me." Hazel looked up from her book and smiled faintly. "I'm afraid of dying. But I'm more afraid of regret." Silence. Alexander stared into the flames, his eyes distant, as if he were looking into a past only he could see. Then he began to tell her. About Catherine. About how they met when they were both young and naive. About their love, fierce and reckless and unafraid of anything. About the night Catherine died. About the feeling of holding his wife's cold hand in the hospital. About Mia sitting beside her mother's body with blood all over her tiny hands. About the guilt he carried for 6 years. Guilt that if he hadn't been Alexander Blackwood, Catherine wouldn't have died. Mia wouldn't have lost her mother. Wouldn't have lost her hearing. Hazel listened without interrupting. She didn't judge him. Didn't offer cheap comfort. Didn't say meaningless things like everything will be okay. She only listened. And when Alexander finished, she said softly, "Alexander, you didn't choose for Catherine to die. You didn't choose for Mia to lose her mother, but you chose to love Mia every day for 6 years. Even in despair. Even in helplessness. That's what matters." For the first time in 6 years, Alexander felt lighter, as if a massive stone had been lifted off his chest. When Hazel stood to leave, he reached out and took her hand, just for a second. Just a gentle hold, but it was enough for both of them to understand that something was changing between them. Something larger than gratitude. Something deeper than respect. Something neither of them dared to name yet. 6 months later, on Mia's 9th birthday, the Blackwood estate overflowed with sound and color, for the first time in its history. Balloons in every color hung throughout the garden. Silk ribbons were wrapped around tree trunks, and a live band played bright, cheerful melodies on a small stage built in the middle of the lawn. Children's laughter echoed everywhere. Dozens of kids running, playing, shrieking with pure delight. These children weren't wealthy, and they weren't the sons and daughters of business partners. They came from the charity foundation Alexander had created 3 months earlier. A foundation dedicated to finding and helping children who had been misdiagnosed. Children like Mia. Children the medical system had abandoned for profit. Hazel ran that foundation. In 3 months of work, they had found 7 children who had been diagnosed incorrectly. 7 children who were given back a normal life. 7 small miracles created by the hands of people brave enough to look closer and care more. And among the children playing, there was a 22-year-old young man laughing brightly as he played ball with them, Tommy. He was completely healthy now, his skin rosy, his body full of energy. Nothing like the pale, hollow shadow in a hospital bed only 6 months earlier. Hazel watched her brother from a distance, and her heart filled with gratitude. The party reached its peak when Mia stepped onto the small stage to say thank you. The 9-year-old stood before the crowd, long black hair braided into 2 pretty plaits, a pink dress puffed like a princess, big eyes sparkling with happiness. Her speech was still a little slow, and she still had to pause sometimes to find the right word. But it was clear and confident in a way no one would have dared imagine 6 months earlier. "Thank you everyone, for coming to Mia's birthday," she began, her voice carrying through the microphone. Before, Mia lived in silence. Mia couldn't hear anything. Mia thought the world was like that. Mia thought Mia would live in silence forever. She paused and took a deep breath. But then someone came. Someone who wasn't a doctor, not a specialist. Just a person who cleaned Mia's house. But she saw Mia. Really saw Mia. Not as a sick child. Not as the boss's daughter. But as Mia. Just Mia. She turned to look at Hazel. Her eyes shining with tears. Miss Hazel gave Mia sound. Gave Mia a voice. Gave Mia the wind. The rain. The piano. Daddy's voice saying Daddy loves Mia. Mia's voice caught. Miss Hazel gave Mia a family. Mia loves you. So much. Hazel stood beneath the stage, tears pouring without control. She climbed up, wrapped Mia in a tight embrace, and they cried in each other's arms as the crowd's applause thundered around them. Then Alexander stepped forward. The once feared mafia boss, the man who had made all of Chicago tremble, stood there with reddened eyes and a trembling smile. He set one hand on Mia's shoulder, and with the other he took Hazel's hand. In front of everyone, without hiding, without hesitation. She didn't just save Mia, he said, his voice low and thick with emotion. She saved me too. After the party, as the sun began to set, and the Chicago sky turned orange-red, Hazel stood alone on the second-floor balcony, looking out at the city stretching